Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for Zooming In, where we engage with illustrious graduates about timely topics. We pivoted today because of what is happening in America today, and we rescheduled Lizak for June 19th per her very gracious suggestion. Today, I'm going to do my best to tackle some topics pertaining to criminal justice reform and racial inequality with a wonderful graduate, Rahsaan Hall, class of 1998. I'm going to dive into his bio and tell you a little bit about his background, and then we will have questions for Rahsaan. Rahsaan Hall is the director of the Racial Justice Program for the ACLU of Massachusetts. In this role, Rahsaan helps develop the ACLU's integrated advocacy approach to address racial justice issues. Through legislative advocacy, litigation, and community engagement, the program works on issues that deeply impact communities of color and historically disenfranchised communities. Rahsaan also manages the ACLU's program called What a Difference a DA Makes campaign. I love that name, Rahsaan, to educate state residents about the power and the influence of district attorneys. Prior to joining the ACLU, Rahsaan was the deputy director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and Economic Justice, where his work included policy and legislative advocacy, community outreach, maintaining a litigation caseload of voting rights, police misconduct, and public accommodation cases. Rahsaan headed up the Voting Rights Project that included the coordination of the statewide election protection initiatives, voting rights litigation, and his prior involvement in community coalitions on redistricting after the last decennial census. He also served as an assistant district attorney for the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office. A significant portion of his work in the DA's office included his time in the Safe Neighborhood Initiative and senior trial units where he prosecuted drug, gang, and homicide cases. In addition to leading the ACLU's Racial Justice Program, he also serves on the Hyams Foundation Board of Trustees and is a member of the Massachusetts IALTA Committee. Rahsaan is admitted to practice in Massachusetts and the U.S. District Court for the District of Massachusetts. He's a graduate of The Ohio State University and Northeastern University School of Law, as well as the Andover Newton Theological School. He's an ordained reverend in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Welcome, Rahsaan.
Thank you, Mel. This is a great opportunity to come and talk to some of my favorite people, Northeastern Law School alum.
That's great. So typically I start with a little bit of a lighter question, such as what brought you to Northeastern Law? But I know your dad fairly well, David Hall, and he was the former dean of Northeastern University School of Law from 1993 to 1998. And I'm fairly certain that is what brought you to Northeastern Law. I adore your dad.
Yeah.
Is that why?
That and a unique opportunity called tuition remission.
Very helpful, right?
Yes.
So I'm going to start with a really general, broad question. And I'm just going to listen after that. What are your thoughts as we have gone through numerous tragic events in recent weeks that are just a few in a long line of abuses? The tragic killings of Ahmaud Arbery in Brunswick, Georgia, Breonna Taylor in Louisville, George Floyd in Minneapolis, Amy Cooper's reprehensible actions in Central Park, where she made false accusations and weaponized the police by her 911 call. What are some general thoughts that you have had in the last 2 weeks?
These incidents are a part of a longer history of the narrative of anti-Black racism and violence in America. The murder of George Floyd is no different than the murder of Eric Garner. The execution of Breonna Taylor is no different than the execution by police officers of Tatiana Jefferson. The vigilantism behind the murder of Ahmaud Arbery is no different than that behind the murder of Trayvon Martin or Emmett Till. it's a part of the legacy. And that's what makes what happened in Central Park with Amy Cooper that much more infuriating, because that talismanic invocation of the threat and danger of Black people could have resulted in the death of Christian Cooper. And even though a lot of focus and attention has been around these extrajudicial killings of these people or these vigilante murders, the protests, the uprisings, the resistance also grows out of a larger frustration and being infuriated with the conditions that people of color, but Black people in particular, find ourselves in. This is all happening in the midst of a global pandemic with the COVID-19 virus, where Black people are disproportionately contracting and dying of this virus at alarming rates. The education gap will be exacerbated because of the technology gap that exists. The economic and wealth disparities that exist will be made worse. And there are many Black businesses that won't come back from this pandemic. And it's all in the backdrop of rising fascist dictatorial leadership coming out of the White House. And that's what makes this moment seem somewhat different. But it's all a part of a longer thread of the narrative of the vulnerability of Black life in America.
Yes, we remember the LA riots, or at least I do. I mean, it's just, it comes, it seems like in waves. This seems particularly poignant on the heels of COVID. Like it's just overwhelming. It's almost too much, all of these things. And Amy Cooper made me sick to my stomach, just sick to my stomach, the way that was handled. It just was such a stark reminder of what people have in their heads and their hearts. And that one really impacted me. But thank you for that, for your thoughts on kind of where we are right now. Next question. I watched your MLK commemoration keynote talk at MIT in February of 2019. I watched that this week. And you discussed white supremacy in a new way. And I want to have you speak to that idea. In that same speech, you quoted MLK as he spoke about violence as the riot of the unheard. That seems particularly poignant and sadly incredibly relevant this week. Part B is, what is your understanding of the unheard, and what specific steps can we take to change that?
Right. That speech was focused on MLK's "I Have a Dream" speech, where he posited an idea about whether or not the promise of freedom and democracy and what America has to offer, or whether or not America is bankrupt. And in exploring that, I talked through a long history of the seamless thread the seamless connection between slavery through the Reconstruction, the post-Reconstruction periods, the Jim Crow era, from the war on poverty, the war on drugs, the war on crime, and then mass incarceration. And in talking about that, it's all premised on the notion of white supremacy, and not white supremacy in the sense that people normally think of neo-Nazis and skinheads and the Ku Klux Klan, but an ideology and an understanding of the world that centers and prioritizes white life, white property, white beliefs, and white culture at the expense of the life, property, experience, and culture of people of color, but particularly Black people. There needed to be a way to justify the enslavement of Black people for economic means. And so the creation of a superior and inferior race is at the heart of what white supremacy is, and all of the tropes and ideologies that go along with who Black people are or who people of color are in general are in service of this idea that there is a superior race. And even though people all distance themselves from this notion, I even have people that I know and have worked with in the past who say, you know, I don't see color. That's very problematic because this nation is shaped by the experience of color and is informed by the structure of white supremacy. And so, you know, and so going to this quote of Dr. King when he said, riots are the voice of the unheard, he then goes on to posit this question, what is it that America has failed to hear? Because at the time of that speech, this is another speech, there were riots in major urban centers, and these riots were an outgrowth, or these uprisings rather, were an outgrowth of the contingent intolerable conditions that existed in major urban centers where there were high concentrations of Black people, high rates of unemployment, high rates of poverty, high rates of low educational attainment and low economic opportunity or employment opportunities, substandard housing, and over-policing. And the precipitating event in each of those uprisings throughout the city was an act of police aggression or violence against someone in the community. And so Dr. King was saying, I could no more condemn these so-called riots without condemning these contingent intolerable conditions. And so what it is that America has failed to hear is that America has had its knee on the neck of Black people since we were brought here in 1619. And that's what has been failed to hear, been heard, is the structure of white supremacy has stifled out the demands, the needs, the concerns of people of color, but Black people in particular.
Thank you. It's very timely. You know, the talk that you gave there, it's all very relevant and timely. So my next question for you is, what systems impact racism the most in your opinion? Is it the criminal justice system, the voting system? Can you say a few words about the relationship between the various systems of marginalization and discrimination? Like, how does voting disenfranchisement, an issue that you work on a lot, and I know you're going to speak for me at a voting rights conference in the fall, looking forward to that. How does that intersect with police accountability and the criminal justice reform system?
All right, well, I'll start from the end of that question. The ability to elect representatives to carry forward the concerns of a particular community are what make this democracy what it is. And so separate and apart from voter apathy, which is just folks saying, I'm not going to participate because whoever is elected does not address the concerns, or it doesn't matter if I vote because whoever comes into office isn't going to change the system. And I can understand why people have a problem with that worldview, but I also, as a Black man in America, understand why people say that and feel that way, and so when you think about the choices that people have, who they are voting for, in reality, a lot of elected officials have not prioritized the experience of people of color and make it opportunistic to come and talk to them and hear from them when it is election season. But when they are in the halls of the Capitol, whether it's Beacon Hill or any other state capitol or the nation's capital, the process of the creation of legislation or policy is something that excludes the voice and input and perspective of people of color. That said, having representation or having people in the legislature or in elected leaders rather, recognize that there is a political power base that has the power to bring someone into office or remove them from office, increases the opportunity for having greater impact. I think the systems, the failures of the systems and structures in our community that perpetuate these disparities and perpetuate the disenfranchisement of Black communities are directly related to who are the people in office. The fact that the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was gutted in 2013 by the Shelby County decision is a function of the electoral system. How can an act that significant, the crown jewel of the civil rights movement, that was renewed multiple times, and the last time it was renewed for 25 years, based on testimony of current act of voter disenfranchisement, a long record of all of the reasons why the Voting Rights Act still needed to be in existence. And since 2013, we have not seen any meaningful legislation that has been passed to address what was taken away from us in the Voting Rights Act. And so you have people that are voting all the time, and just like, what difference does it make? And so when you think about the ability to elect a person that is going to represent the interests, what type of funding comes to your community, what type of laws get implemented, you know, the 1994 crime bill is a piece of legislation that has had a deleterious effect on Black communities. It was a key driver in the war on drugs that ransacked Black communities and sent hundreds of thousands of people to jail and destroyed entire communities and lives. So, you know, there's not one particular system that is that has the most significant impact of racism. I definitely believe the criminal legal system is a significant part of it. The educational system is one. The healthcare system, when you look at healthcare disparities, they're all a part of it. And so the system that impact racism the most is the system of white supremacy again.
Okay, that's good to hear. Yeah, I only mentioned a few, which were criminal justice voting, but there are certainly many others like the educational system, healthcare systems, etc., and white supremacy. What does the ACLU, I'm turning it to your work a little bit, what does the ACLU do to combat racial inequality? What are some of the key projects that you all?
Sure. Well, separate and apart from, you know, the work of the Racial Justice Program, the ACLU fights for people's civil rights and civil liberties in the courts, in the legislatures, and in community. And so we take an integrated advocacy approach to doing our work, whether it's with our litigation, and litigation, for example, fighting against the Muslim ban. Or fighting against some of the unfair standards in immigration bond hearing, or in trying to reunite families who were separated at the border, but also litigation to uncover a drug laboratory scandal. If anyone hasn't seen it already, watch How to Fix a Drug Laboratory Scandal on Netflix. That was a case that you was involved in. There's like a 5-second cameo appearance that I get at the end.
I'll have to watch that one. How are you doing with immigration bond hearings? Have you made it?
We had some success in the federal district court. My colleagues Adriana Lafai and Dan McFadden handled that matter, and it has shifted the burden from the individual who's being detained to have to prove that they're not a flight risk to the government. That they are the ones to justify detaining someone. You know, some of the other advocacy that we do to address racial justice issues are through the criminal justice work. We engaged in a Living While Black on College project where we're affirmatively reaching out to colleges and universities to have them develop racially just policing practices, policy, to avoid all of those situations where Black people are getting the cops called on them and their college students that belong there. Our What a Difference a DA Makes campaign was really focused on shifting the narrative about what it is prosecutors do and how much power they have to impact communities of color, but particularly Black communities. So there are a whole host of things. that we're engaged in. Some of the legislation that we've been pushing for this past session was to require police to collect race data on the motor vehicle stops that they make, so we can really get an assessment on how racial profiling is happening in the Commonwealth.
A great project. You lead me to my next question, is that you were a former ADA, and how does your background as an ADA inform your work today, do you think?
It really gave me a lot of insight and perspective, or gives me a lot of insight and perspective into how this system operates, how this system is deficient and unjust. For the 8 years that I served as a Suffolk County prosecutor, I would say about 80% of the cases I handled were of people of color. I started out in Dorchester District Court, and I ended the last 5 years were in Superior Court. I started in a Safe Neighborhood Initiative unit, which was like an anti-gang unit, and then in the senior trial unit where I handled gun, drug, or where I handled homicide cases. But overwhelming majority of those cases were of Black people. And I saw a lot of the cases, and subsequently understanding, having done, subsequently looking at some of the data, like 95% of the cases that are prosecuted in any county at any given time are district court cases. But the narrative that exists about who's being prosecuted and what the police are doing out there is one of the murderers and the rapists and the home invaders and the drug traffickers. And that's only a small portion of the case. And when you're in court, when someone's in court and see and has an opportunity to witness the vast sea of humanity that is being processed through these courts as grist for the mill of injustice, it's hard to see this system as one that is just. And that's why I don't call it a criminal justice system. It's a system of laws, but certainly not one of justice. And so I think that's how that informs my perspective in the work that I do.
Today, yeah. How can we change the police culture from warrior to guardian? It's a tough question, but
yeah, it's not a tough question. We need to defund the police. We need to make a greater investment in community-based resources. A lot of the things that police end up policing in communities are things that grow out of poverty, of substance use issues, and mental health issues. A lot of it is intervention into communities where there are a lack of services, where there have been substandard education. And so if there were a greater investment in community-based alternatives, community-based programming, and there's studies that show the cities that have a more robust summer youth jobs program have fewer young people being involved in criminal activities. Cities that have more robust violence intervention, a non-police violence intervention programs, see reductions in violence. If we were to make a greater investments in those, we would get better outcomes and have police engage fewer people on things that they shouldn't be engaged in. We need more counselors and social workers in our schools than police. So that's one of the ways to change it. And then we need more women on the force. It's a very macho culture and environment that is driven by kind of male ego and male alpha male culture.
Yeah,
so
excellent point. Yeah. What can white people do to stand with people of color? How can we help affect change in the criminal justice system? Besides voting in more people of color at the local and national level, what are some concrete things we can do?
I think it always begins with listening to people of color, listening to our experiences, listening to our pain, and not necessarily trying to fix it, and finding out what it is that people need or want from you. I think advocating for legislation and policy fixes that are going to address the injustices in the criminal legal system are good. And so following organizations that are doing this law reform advocacy work, and then when our organizations, when we put out the call for support to call legislators, do that. But then also, like, get your people. Talk to the people who are in your sphere of influence, and do your best to engage them in conversations that show that there is another reality, and that the experience of people of color and in this instance, Black people, is one that it should not be defined by the narratives that exist within law enforcement about what's happening in our communities, because it's very it's very one-sided.
Thank you. That's important. And I definitely wanted to ask you that today. How can we remain optimistic when all of these horrific events are happening? The killing of Black people in the midst of a pandemic. Does your background as an ordained reverend sustain you at times like this?
It does. I think being a part of a faith community as well is something that encourages me. I come from a faith tradition where, we believe that no matter what has happened, that there is a redemptive value in all of humanity. And so my hope is that this process of tribulation is a part of the redemption of this nation. And those seeds of hope have been planted very deep in me, and hope springs eternal.
It seems like it might be a day of reckoning. Like we may be getting close to where we can turn things around on a permanent level, not, a wave for several years until the next horrific act comes along. But I'm feeling a little bit optimistic about all of this, despite the horrible, horrible tragedies that took place. What organizations besides Northeastern Law and the ACLU should we be supporting?
Yeah, that's always a great question. And so, of course, support the ACLU. It's interesting because Trump said he was going to be a jobs creator, but who knew it was going to be for the ACLU?
It worked. Good point.
It works. But, I think there are a lot of Black and Brown led organizations that are doing grassroots advocacy and organizing that we try to be supportive of and in lockstep. And so a great organization here in Boston is Families for Justice is Healing, which was founded by one of my classmates, another Northeastern alum, Andrea James.
Oh, great.
As working to eliminate the incarceration of women and girls. She also sits on she's also the director of the National Council for Incarcerated and Formerly Incarcerated Women and Girls. I think another organization is Violence in Boston, a woman by the name of Monica Cannon, is leading a program to really engage communities to reduce violence. And bring about healing. There's groups like Black and Pink that work with incarcerated people who are LGBTQ. And so those are some of the organizations that immediately come to mind. And then there are also the kind of larger legacy organizations like the NAACP, the Boston branch, as well as the national. But there are, or CARE.
Yep.
And I think another smaller kind of progressive organization in the criminal justice space is the Muslim Justice League, that's really focusing on protecting communities from state surveillance.
Okay, great. That's a good list. And then in a similar vein, do you have any reading recommendations for our listeners?
One that's really hot right now is Professor Ibram Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist. It's a great read, and he's actually coming here now to Boston to open up a center on the study of racism. Brian Stevenson is always Just Mercy is a great one. I'm assuming most folks have read that. I think another book that has really had an impact on me is The Warmth of Other Suns by Diane Wilkerson. It describes the Great Migration from a macro perspective of how Black people were fleeing for their lives from the South, but also seeking new opportunities. And she tells that macro narrative also through the story of 4 individual families. So that's a really good read. And then, of course, anything by Toni Morrison.
Yeah, I was an English major, so I read a lot of Toni Morrison. Another thought I just wanted to say is that Brian Stevenson's movie is streaming for free on all digital platforms in the month of June. So if you didn't have a chance to read the book, I did see it in the movie theater, and it was incredibly powerful and moving, and brings up, the Innocence Project and that kind of work as well, which is also key. One last question. Is there anything else you want to share with us today? Northeastern and Northeastern Law graduates, any other thoughts that you want to share?
I think, Northeastern is just a very special institution. Its location in the city and the ethos of the law school as a public interest law school, I think make it very special when you look at some of the people who have graduated from Northeastern Law and the things that they have gone on to do. It gives us a level of standing, and I think we really need to use that to influence this moment. This moment is different. There are conversations that are happening in the State House. There are conversations that are happening in the corporate sector, and to the extent that anyone can lift up and herald the dawning of a new day, that racial justice must be the mandate for such a time as this. And I encourage everyone to embrace that.
Those are wonderful last thoughts. We do have the Attorney General here. We have the President of the Massachusetts Senate. We have Rachel Rollins. We have a lot of graduates doing great work out there, but none more than you. So thank you for all you're doing for racial justice. You're perfect in this role. Your voice is calming and soothing. It must be the ordained reverend part, but it does give me hope. And I just really appreciate your stepping away from a board meeting, away from Bill Belichick to give us a few minutes and to share with everyone some things we can do, some concrete ways we can make some change. And thank you for all you're doing. I appreciate it. And thanks for being with us here today.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Good to see you, Rasan. Tell me how that next meeting goes.
Okay, I will.
Go Pats. Go Pats. All right. Take care. Thank you.
You too.